We started 2 weeks ago a look at the 12 steps and basically introduced it. And tonight and over the next couple of weeks, I want to talk about step 1. And if you're not familiar with it, I'll read it to you. It's just we admitted that we were powerless over our addiction and that our lives had become unmanageable. What we talked about last week is that as we come to the steps, what the steps are really about is how to become healthy. And that's, if you want to summarize it, it's that if I'm going to overcome addiction, I need to become healthy. And being healthy includes being healthy physically, psycho. I need to deal with wounds from the past. I need to deal with kind of my whole thinking and psychological stuff. And then social, I need to get healthy relationships, because if I don't, they take me back. And then I need to get healthy spiritually. And it's only as a person begins to get healthy in those 4 areas that they really have an effective way of overcoming addiction. And that's what we focused on. And so just a couple things that we took out of that. And it's that addiction and dealing with addiction or recovery is a lot more than just saying, I quit, I never want to do it again. In other words, to take it further, what the steps are telling us is if I look at my addiction as really a symptom of being unhealthy. And so if I want to deal with my addiction, I just have to go underneath and deal with the unhealthy stuff. And that's what we are making the focus on. And then we looked at that step 1 basically gives us the bad news before we get the good news. And it's very interesting that most of us don't pay much attention to good news unless we get the bad news. Or we don't want to really hear about how to be healthy if we're not convinced we're unhealthy. In other words, I don't think I need to learn that because I think I'm already healthy. And so we start at this step 1 where it says that we admitted we're powerless. And I find for a lot of people that term powerless is a confusing term. And if you aren't an addict but have somebody in your life or your family that is an addict, and they have told you step 1 and that they're powerless, you probably have found yourself not quite sure what they mean. And what might be even more interesting is that some people might give you a different definition of powerless than another person might. And so all of a sudden your head's spinning and saying, what is powerless? And so let me just give you an overview of that, and then we're going to look at a couple issues around it. If a person is powerless, bottom line, what it is saying is that thing has become my master and I am its slave. It now exercises a power over me that I can't resist. And if you're an addict, you'll understand this perfectly. You may get up in the morning and say, I do not want to use today, or I do not want to overeat today, or I do not want to gamble today. And as the day progresses, it's like this dark power slowly takes control, and before you know it, you're doing the very things you didn't want to do. And you're doing, or you're not doing, the very things you said you would do. And you find yourself this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, split personality, but it's the dark side that just keeps winning out. And it overpowers your willpower, it overpowers your desire, and you become defeated by that very thing. That's what we mean by powerless. Now, let me just expand it into 4 areas. For most addicts, to be powerless means this. If I was to pick up one drink, or if I was to take one hoot, it wouldn't stop at 1. And so as soon as I take that one, it sets in play a series of things inside of me that cause me to then be powerless to stop that progression. That's the first thing. But you may try to trick yourself and say, well, I just had 2 drinks yesterday and I stopped, so therefore I'm not powerless. But you need to take it to a bigger picture than just one day. Because for some of you, you might be able to have 2 drinks today and 2 drinks tomorrow, But gradually what you're going to find is you go 3 drinks, 4 drinks, 5 drinks, 6 drinks, and before you know it, it's full-blown all over again. So you can kind of half resist it for a little while, but it's only a matter of time until you're just totally the slave of this master again. But it goes beyond that. Some people, they say, I don't need recovery, I can just quit. And so they quit and they do okay for a while, but what I want you to see for them, the powerless piece is this. As long as I don't change anything in my life, it's only a matter of time before I relapse and I'm right back to where I start. So I might be able to quit for a period of time and think I'm powerful, but if I'm not working on anything, I soon will be very powerless again because I will relapse. I need to add one thing. If you are not an addict, but you love an addict, step 1 applies to you as well. And it's the hard reality to admit that I am powerless over this person that I love who's an addict. I want to keep them sober. I want them to be sober more than they want to be sober. I try to help them, control them, manipulate them. I want to do it, but I find out I'm powerless. They just keep using. And that is a very, very hard thing for every loved one, parent, whatever, to admit. So that's how I would define powerless. Now let me just take you to what I would include over my years of experience in dealing with addicts. Addicts tend to play tricks on themselves. I don't know if you ever realized that. We play little mental games and mental gymnastics, and so we kind of tweak the meaning of powerless to suit us. And here's what I would say is probably the most common thing. If a person would come into Tamarack or to Finding Freedom brand new, they might say to me, I am powerless over alcohol. And when I first started counseling with addicts, I believed that. They thought that they were fully committed that they are powerless. But here's what I learned. In their mind, what they were really saying was, I'm powerless right now, but I don't plan on continuing to be powerless for long. You see, what I am hoping is that I am going to be able to use again. That's the big plan. I just can't do it, control it right now, so I'm powerless temporarily. The reason I'm in treatment is to learn how not to be powerless over it, to learn how to control my using. And the reason I go through the steps and go to meetings and go to counseling is because I am looking for somebody to give me the magic recipe for controlling my using. You know what? You might be somebody that's gone online and you've checked every possible website looking for the miracle cure. And so in your mind, I'm only powerless temporarily. Or what I find with some is this. I'm powerless right now, but guess what? I've just been on a 3-month bender. And I'm playing exhausted. I'm playing worn myself out. But just give me a little bit of time to get rested and kind of get my life back on track, and then I'll be powerful again. And so their idea of powerless is only a temporary admission. Number 2, and this I would say is the second most common thing, and this is what confuses family members, because you might say, they told me I'm powerless, therefore I can't help myself, I'm an addict, I'll use. You see, I've got a disease that I'm powerless over, and so I can't not use. Doesn't that sound great? Permission now from recovery counselors that I can't stop using, therefore just accept it. Wonderful little twist on it that I'm sure some of you have tried. The third one, I'm powerless over drugs. But you know what? I don't want to look at any other areas in my life because I don't think I'm powerless over anything else in my life, just over the drugs. And I don't want to admit or look at the fact that I might be powerless over activities and things that produce the identical chemicals in my brain that drugs, alcohol produce. Let me give you an example. Some of you may have come here, and as you look at your life, you realize that you've gone from one unhealthy relationship to another. And so in your mind, it's I'm powerless over drugs and alcohol, but I'm definitely not powerless over those relationships. But here's what I want you to realize. What we now know about the brain is this. When you receive an unhealthy relationship and you get unhealthy attention and you get unhealthy quote-unquote love, it releases in your brain the identical chemicals to true love and the identical chemicals to drugs and alcohol. So what do you think your brain is addicted to? To the chemical. However way I can get it. And if it happens to be through a bad relationship, well, it sure feels like real love to me, so I'm going to keep going on in these relationships. So I'm willing to concede the fact that I am powerless over drugs. That's the end of the discussion. We're not looking at anything else. And that happens over and over again. In other words, number 4, to flip it, it's thinking the only thing that has made my life unmanageable are drugs and alcohol. Everything else is peachy keen. I love the lifestyle. It's not a problem. I can control it. It's just the drugs and alcohol I have an issue with. We're going to talk more about that next week. Let me give you the final one. I'm powerless. And this is, you'll understand it because you're an addict. It takes a little bit of work if you're not an addict. I'm powerless, but I'm not totally powerless. I'm just a little bit powerless. Now that makes absolutely no sense if you think about it rationally. How can you be a little bit powerless? That means I'm just not as powerful. But what the rationale is this. I am counting on the fact that my drugs and alcohol isn't really a big problem, and so it's not going to take a lot of power to fix it up. And so I'm not powerless like my life's a total mess and I'm totally helpless to straighten it out. It's just I'm a little bit powerless over this one area. And so I'm really hoping that I'm going to find a quick and easy solution. And that is your hope around being powerless. If this is a little problem, it only needs an easy little solution, and everything's good. And then for some people who either go into 12-step stuff or into church Christian stuff, they go, I'm powerless, but God's going to make it all better. So I'm fixed now. And that becomes my way out of my powerless, and we'll get to that in step 2 and 3. So that's what I would say I have seen the little changes that people have when it comes to being powerless. And so I don't know if that resonates with you. You might say, you know what, I've been saying I'm powerless, but when I think about it, what I'm really saying is one of those 5 things. And I'm not convinced I'm totally powerless. So that takes me to the next area. That word admitted. To me, that is something that sounds easy to anybody that's not an addict. But that word to admit, I am powerless, is probably one of the hardest things that you will ever do. And I want to give you some reasons why I think it's probably the hardest thing for somebody to do who's in addiction and who comes from very dysfunctional family. When you consider the fact that you have based your life totally around that the drugs and alcohol, gambling, whatever, has been my best friend. It has helped me get out of my pain. It has helped me to not feel. It has helped me to cope. When I have had that as a best friend, it is so hard to admit that that best friend has become my worst enemy. And that is why the word that is so often used in recovery, that is the opposite of admitted, is denial. I do not want to face the fact. I want to deny that I have a problem. I want to come up with some other explanation for the unmanageability of my life. I do not want to admit that this friend has become my enemy. And we're going to look at that in more detail in the weeks ahead. So let me go on to the second one. If you came out of a dysfunctional family, you learned a couple things very well. And it makes this whole admitting thing extremely difficult. Number one, if you came out of a dysfunctional family, you learned that you could not trust anybody. And so what then comes out of the reality, I can't trust anybody, that means I can only trust myself, and that means I have to be in control. And so when I come to the place where I admit that I'm powerless, what am I admitting? I no longer am in control. Do you realize how hard that is? Because your whole life is only worked in your mind if you're in control. And so to be out of control kills you. And your brain is saying, no, don't admit that, don't admit that. You have to find a way to control it. You can't lose control now. And your brain works and works and works because the fear of giving or not being in control is a powerful thing. Why? Because if I'm not in control, I will get hurt. And I don't want to go there. There's a second piece to that. B, what you learned in that family and why you had to be in control is you never show weakness. Because if you show weakness, you'll get laughed at. You will get it used against you. You will get hurt. Therefore, when you come out of that, guess what you never do? You never ask for help. Because to ask for help is to admit weakness, which is to ask for trouble. And so for a person to admit I am powerless is admitting weakness. And that is a scary, scary place to go. The third one that comes out of that family is you learned early in life that you were not just a person who failed on occasion, but you were a failure. All of your life has been trying to compensate for that. Because when you were seen as a failure, what happened inside of you was tragic because you were laughed at, you were abused, you were put down and disrespected, and you faced humiliation all the time. More than that, you were not loved. You were seen as unlovable. And in your mind, the reason I'm unlovable is because I'm a failure. And so you have spent your life trying to prove that you're a success and that you're lovable. And being a failure is the hardest thing in the world. And so we've talked about this before, but what most people do is they build an external world that looks perfect. They are going to be successful on the outside. The problem is that the internal world is a mess. And that internal world gradually seeps out to affect and undermine the perfect external world. And that external world begins to crumble or become unmanageable. Do you realize how hard it is if you've had some success at building an external world that looks successful and it's got you attention and it's got you love, and now for you to say my external world is falling apart and I am failing. Wow. That, therefore, in your mind means nobody will ever love me again, and nobody will ever look at me and see me as a success. They will have no respect for me, and they'll probably humiliate me and put me down and laugh at me. And the humiliation is something that feels worse than death at times. And so you're driven by this drive. I can't admit that I'm powerless. That goes against everything I have worked to not be. And that therefore means I'm a failure. There's a third thing that makes this so difficult to admit. If I come to the point at 40 or 50 years of age where my life is now unmanageable, and I admit that I'm powerless over drugs and alcohol, what I am afraid of is this. What I am saying and admitting is not just that I'm powerless over drugs and alcohol, but that all that I have built my life on has been wrong. And therefore, that I have built my life on a whole bunch of lies. That means I've wasted most of my life following the wrong formula for success and for happiness. That means I have built a foundation for my life that is proven to be crumbling. And it is proven to not stand the test of time. How hard is it to say, I have lived my life 40, 50 years. Whoopee, I've been believing lies. I have believed lies, and now look at me, a total failure. And now I have fewer years ahead of me than behind me. And the thought of now trying to get my life sorted out after believing all those lies is so difficult. I feel like a fool. I feel like a failure. I feel that if I admit that this area is an area of failure and I've been following lies, what will happen? Will I begin finding other areas that are messed up and based on lies? And if I go to another area, will that lead me to a third area that's messed up and based on lies? And will I then find that my whole life has been messed up and based on lies? And so we want to just kind of keep it to, I'm a failure when it comes to drugs and alcohol, but I really am afraid to look any deeper than that because of that. Let me just bring this together, the bottom line. And I've said it, but let me repeat it. To admit that I am powerless feels like death. And I don't know if you've experienced that feeling. It feels like everything I live for is a mistake. Everything I've sought to accomplish has failed. Here I sit in my own pile with nothing to show for it except loser. And to admit that when I've been working my whole life to overcome that feels like death. But can I give you something? Jesus said a very interesting thing when he was teaching. He said, except a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abides alone. Now let me explain that. If you were to go to a little grain of wheat and just have to imagine in your wacky brain that grain of wheat can talk to you and you can have a conversation. And that grain of wheat says to you, I want to have a life that is fruitful, a life that makes a difference. I want to do that. And you say, well, I don't see any sprouts coming out of you. I don't see any new grains of wheat growing out of you. How are you going to have this productive, fruitful life? I don't know, I'll just try harder. No. You want to know how? You go on the ground and you die. And then once you die, believe it or not, this green little blade of grass comes up. And before you know it, it's shooting out stalks. And you have hundreds of kernels of grain on that one stalk. And what Jesus' point was this. When you have lived a life a certain way that is based on lies, the only way to come to a new life is to die to the old one. And that's exactly how it feels, like death. And so you know what I find people do all the time? And it's why step one, I think, is the first step, but it's also why it's a very hard step. Because they want to say, I don't want to die to that old way of life. I don't want to die and say it's all been a mess. I'll just try harder. I just got to somehow dig a little deeper. I just somehow got to find another solution. But the path to life is through death. And that is a sad but true reality. So let me just leave you with this. If you come to the point where you're really, truly feeling and know you're powerless, and you can finally just say, I'm powerless, yeah, it's going to feel awful, but I guarantee you that life will come out of that. And good life will come out of that. But it's a scary place to go to get there. And so I just hope that you can walk away from tonight and go, either I've done it and I know what that feels like and I'm starting to experience some of that good life, or that you can say, okay, now I think I'm getting it. I'm totally powerless. And that means that death of me. And it scares me to death, but I need to do that. And that's why it goes on in the steps. It doesn't leave you hanging there. It goes to step 2. That there's a power greater than ourself that will step in and help us once we admit we're powerless. Let's just pray together. Father, I just want to pray for Carlos tonight and for the family. And I pray for each person here and for those who are resisting that admission of powerlessness as they look at their life that is unmanageable. I just pray that you would just push them to that place where they cannot not admit it any longer, and that they would finally get to that place. For your glory I pray. Amen.